Thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's a wonderful audience because there are, on the one hand, many people that I know and think very, very highly of, and many people I've wanted to meet. And this entire program is covering all of the issues that seem to me to be the most important issues that humanity faces right now. The talk that I'm going to give is taken from a paper which is quite a bit longer, and that's actually part of a new book project. I don't know what the title of the book is supposed to be. Necessary Egalitarianism is one version of it. I thought another version of this would be what I would tell Donald Trump, and that's the one up here, which would be, Donald, actually, you have a choice. You can have the inequality that you love, or you can have the survival of civilization. Okay? So that's really the topic today. Let's see if I can make this work. Which one is it going to be? Did that work? Okay, yeah. So this is basically the argument that I'm going to make, which is that we face a set of what can be called global problems, and global problems are problems that affect all of us in the world, but that cannot be solved without international or transnational cooperation, deep cooperation. But our global governance tools, that's the topic of this first and second part of the session, aren't fit for purpose. And in particular, we can improve those tools by sharply reducing inequality across a number of different lines. So that's, now that you've heard it, you can, I know everybody's just eaten, so you can fall asleep for that part. So what the talk is going to do is say a little bit about a set of global problems. I'm going to say something about why they are now impossible to solve, then talk about the benefits of greater equality for solving global problems, and then finally talking about a type of politics that is necessary, which is a type of politics of complex solidarity, which will go, which I'll try to explain a little bit at the end of the talk. So there are these global problems. There's a really small number of these global problems, but some of these global problems are truly existential. For the generation that was born in this century, climate change is even more of an existential problem than nuclear war has been for most of us who are living here or sitting here in this audience. Nuclear war is an existential problem. I mean, George Rathjens used to say that on any day, there was a 1 in 10,000 chance that we would have a thermonuclear war based on possibilities of accident. He would always say that dumb people like me, one of his students, would always think the number was much higher, that it was like 1 in 100 chance that we would have thermonuclear war. But he said, actually 1 in 10,000 every single day is a reason to spend your entire life working on that problem. Climate change is actually more significant in terms of the probability of a disaster that will destroy civilization than the probability of nuclear war, because it's actually just much, much more probable. So these problems, though, they're part of this very small set of problems that from my point of view, should be the only thing that global governance does. I kind of agree with John Bolton in one sense, in the sense of thinking that, John Bolton sits around and says it's terrible that there are all these international organizations doing things, and they shouldn't be involved in things that, happen here in the United States of America. And I agree with him. I think they should only be involved in those things that are actually global, that need to be done at a global level, and it's a relatively small group of problems. I call these problems, I put them into categories, and say that some of them are problems that the policy analysis that we get about them frequently says, if we just listen to the scientists and what we know about the problem, we would decide to solve them. These are sort of problems of the head. If we just actually listen to the scientists about pandemics or habitat loss or something of that sort, we would know that we have to solve them. The second are problems that are associated with, if we could just treat other people like ourselves, as if they were like ourselves, if we could just follow the basic dictates of all of our religious ideas, even if you're a secular humanist like me, we would be able to solve these problems. Branko Milanovic, who's probably the greatest, or the scholar who's done the most for our understanding of global inequalities, one of his first works when he was at the World Bank's chief economist was one where he said, if the rich of the world just met and knew the poor, we'd solve the problem because their heart would be, would open up. And then finally, we have problems which are problems really of courage, because we're a little scared and want to militarize society in order to protect against all of these things. But we have to be brave enough to attack the same problems with some other things. So when I talk to my students, I say, these are easy to remember. They're problems of the head, problems of the heart, and problems of courage. We're going to talk primarily about, in this session, we'll talk primarily about some of the problems of the head. So problems of the head include things like climate change. That's going to be the big one I'll spend most time talking about today. And I want to say something about why this problem is impossible to solve. In the recent report of the International Panel that came out on October 6th, they essentially said, look, to actually get to what we need to have happen, we have to, as a human species, make changes in our everyday work of life that are, in fact, totally unprecedented. We have to do things to change the way our systems of operating the economy and our systems of governance that have never been done that extensively. So that sounds like it's impossible, or at least impossible for now. So that's one answer to why they're impossible. There's a broader set of answers to why they're impossible that's kind of a global governance scholarship answer. And this is a picture of Susan Strange, one of my mentors. And Susan Strange, in her last great article, where she died in 1998, and this article was published in 1999. And in this article, one of the things that was great about it is that a lot of the things Susan believed in her whole life, she started to say were wrong in this article. Like, she said that Marxists were crazy, and then in this article she says, actually, they're right about social class being a problem, some things of that sort. But she says, our global governance system, which she calls the Westphalia system because it was invented by the West. It's connected with that era of the Treaty of Westphalia, and it's a failure for humanity, has these peculiar things that are entailed within the system itself. They're kind of things that are unquestioned about the system that affect our actual system of global governance. So those are the things, and we'll go to them in more detail. So it's a problematic commitment of our global governance system. And the biggest problematic commitment is that actually there's a belief in the state. And the state, so this guy is Thomas Hobbes, great guy, really understood the state well. My friend Christopher Candland at Wellesley College says, Hobbes, the simple version of Hobbes is the state is created to do three things. The big one is to preserve inequalities through force and fraud. Those are 1 and 2. And then it also provides public goods, which actually are used to preserve inequality as well. And then there are possibilities of another kind of state. There was this crazy 19th century radical Democrat, the guy with the beard, who says if we had a true democracy, then it would just provide public goods, and it wouldn't be doing that force and fraud to preserve inequalities. Susan Strange says, having the state as a central institution of our international system and global governance creates a problem, number one. Number two, yes. We're not going to number 2. This is just to say, despite that, we actually have done a great deal with global governance. We've actually done a great deal, including solving a whole series of problems. I mean, we actually have figured out, through these horrible states and interstate cooperation, we've gotten rid of most, not all, slavery. We've gotten rid of pandemics, one of those things that's on those things of the head. We've gotten rid of famine. We've gotten rid of war. Well, we haven't truly gotten rid of war, but boy, there's a lot less war now. The likelihood of dying in war is about 100th of what it was during my father's lifetime, right? And we also have gotten rid of a lot of destitution, absolute poverty around the world. So this is one of the best books on this subject. A friend of mine, Larry Rosenwald, who's a pacifist theorist, talks about how Goldstein's book about the decline of armed conflict is one of the things that every pacifist should read, because he says Goldstein makes it clear that war is something that's more like infectious disease than it is like murder. It's something that we can actually imagine getting rid of, right? And this is the way you do it. This is taken from the scholar Thomas Weiss, who's maybe the American who knows the most about the UN system right now. And it's really like a three-point piece of way to do it. You have a great deal of advocacy work done by social movement organizations to make people believe that this is a problem that needs to be solved, right? So advocacy, you need a lot of research to figure out what would be good policies and how to design institutions. And then the real key thing is you make it somebody's job. Part of what Goldstein argues in Winning the War on War is that the existence of, to go back to the last session, the existence of the United Nations system, the existence of peacekeeping, as well as many other activities, is the thing that most explains the great decrease, even within the state system, of international war. So again, if we remember the earlier one is we think of the Wizard of Oz. Now, this is the four horsemen of the apocalypse are running up against the fence of the United Nations, and those four horsemen of the apocalypse have been slightly hobbled. Okay, great. We've hobbled the horsemen. Okay, but we still have these other things that Susan Strange talks about as things that are, these bad commitments of our global governance system. One of them is that, oh boy, there's a typo right there. Industrial capitalists have been the leading promoters of global governance. This is most of my early work is actually about this. It's about the way in which the global governance system, starting from 1815, but also including the League and the UN, the people who promoted it, the biggest promoters are people who want economic globalization. That's really been the biggest force behind it, which means that capitalism is, as Susan Strange says, deeply reinforced by our global governance system. The final thing is, or at least the second to last thing, is going to be that our global governance system is deeply connected with the great powers. Individual nation states, but it's the great powers that have been the big pushers of global governance. And this has led to some really big problems associated with things that go back to the leaders of industrial capitalism and some of these problems of the head. So two of them that are really clear. One is, and this is a story, I don't know if everybody knows this one, but it's a very important story. In the 19th century, by the 1850s, people knew how to stop pandemics. There was this new theory about diseases called the germ theory of disease. And the germ theory of disease said it was spread by these invisible little particles. And when you start having disease coming on ships from the Far East, which was really where most infectious diseases sort of started to show up in the Middle East and in Europe and then in the Americas, what you needed to do was quarantine those ships, right? We didn't get an international quarantine regime until 1919, even though we had 50 or 60 years of knowing that this was possible. And the reason we didn't get it is because British shipping interests, which controlled basically all international shipping, said we shouldn't have it. And the liberals in the British government said, oh, we should wait until there was more knowledge about what's going on. And the conservatives said the whole germ theory of disease is a French and German plot invented by evil people to stop British shipping interests. There was a scientific reason, of course, even though the British as soon as you started to have the Nobel Prize for Medicine, because Britain was the center of science, even if it was people like Pasteur and Koch who invented the germ theory of disease, the greatest medical scientists from 1901 onward were all British, so they kept winning the Nobel Prize in Medicine. They all thought their government was a bunch of idiots. But the government officially believed in the miasma theory of disease. Bad air is what creates those diseases. So of course quarantine doesn't work. If you want the classic work on this, it's Richard Cooper's International Economic Cooperation back in 1985. We have the same thing in terms of a great power captured by industrial interests in the United States arguing exactly the same thing now. We have industrial interests that are just as powerful as the shipping interests were in Britain in the second half of the 19th century, and they have a different scientific reason why we shouldn't be doing climate change, blah, blah, blah. It's slightly different. And there's a good starting place for this research is Robert Bruhl's research on the way in which the institutionalization of a fake science is done that has successfully adjusted both political parties in different ways to not be able to face climate change in the US. So back to the Susan Strange version is our global governance system involves great powers, it involves industrial capitalists, and therefore this becomes a central problem. One final thing, which is going to sound really weird for these problems of the head, is that the global governance system is based on faith in science and industry. It's based on this idea that eventually science and industry, engineers ultimately, will be able to solve all problems. If you watched the 60 Minutes interview with Donald Trump this week, he told us that we didn't need to worry about the climate change because it was going to change back and would be all okay. And even if it didn't, it would be all okay because the engineers would figure out how to solve it for us, right? These are two pictures of engineers. One is a set of, these are actually people that my wife and I have been studying a lot. So these are the engineering standard setters who turn out to be a global social movement in favor of peace and justice of 1911. Lord Kelvin is there, he's kind of a scientist. Somewhere in there is Tesla, somewhere, they're all actually out to save the world. This is a group of people who work who are at the international, I can't remember whether it's the World Wide Web Consortium or the international, the Internet Engineering Task Force. They all believe in the same thing. They're saving the world as engineers. We heard about some of that a little bit this morning. But whether you're in 1911 or 1880 or 1950 or 1980 or 2018, the engineers will tell you they haven't figured out yet how to do all three of those things at once. It's kind of a problem. If you want to read the whole story, there's a wonderful new book coming out in March from Johns Hopkins University Press. That's the cover, a big screw, by Joanne Yates and Craig Murphy called Engineering Rules, but that talks about some of these issues. Okay, moving right along. What can we do to solve these problems then if we can't rely on the global governance system due to this problem of the global governance system being controlled by the great powers and the great powers and the whole system being controlled by industrial capitalists? Well, you could do what happened after the pandemics in 1919. 1919 was also the year of the great Spanish flu epidemic. it was the year of the end of the First World War, and I'm an American, so I believe that it was the United States, not the Canadians, that made the balance in the First World War work such that the war finally ended. Another way my realist colleagues would say, there was a new balance of power. The US dominated the place. The US couldn't give a rat's bloop about the British shipping interests, and we ended up with a system of quarantine put in place. I have Chinese friends who say we're going to solve global warming in the same way. I don't think we're going to be able to have a world war that the Chinese will be the victor in time, however. So there is an alternative. Climate change, dirty industries in the US today. The alternative would be, remember our friend Mr. Marx, not the Marx that but the Marx of like 1848, the radical Democrat, which is, however, with real democracy in the United States and elsewhere, with the possibility of the interests of the mass of people being, rather than an oligarchy, being those that are translated through the political system, we might be able to change things. I like to remind my students that the historical institutionalist political scientists who look at the formation of democracy worldwide argue quite persuasively that democratic societies, when they have been established and institutionalized, were established and institutionalized by the social movements working for the least advantaged. The story of democracy is the story of, most recently, the women's movement, the labor movement. It's the story of the decolonization movement. It is a story of a series of movements of the least advantaged being successful. Democracy comes from the politics that's aimed at inequality. That's a standard political science-y thing to say. There's nothing really terribly radical about that. Okay, so then I shift to the idea of thinking about durable inequalities, thinking about the problems associated with the inequalities that exist in the world. I'm sure everybody in the audience knows that inequality, in a broad sense, is actually still increasing, not decreasing, within every society, even if by certain types of measures it's decreasing globally, if you look across societies. There are at least 5 different kinds of inequality. There are inequalities that historically are inequalities of gender, of citizenship and occupation or class, and modern inequalities associated with race and with location. The key point that I'm going to try to make in the book that I'm writing, and that I'll just make a brief version of here, is that older inequalities provide the foundation constantly for newer inequalities. And at the same time, the newer inequalities reinforce the old. They work together. You know, history is not only bunk, but it's not even history. They're still with us. So, because this is the kind of argument that to make, you end up having to do really deep historical analysis in order to be able to make it, which I'm only going to do with a little bit of hand-waving here. I like to think of this in terms of the early civilization, and what everybody thinks about with early civilization is step pyramids. Step pyramids, you know, you build a bunch of dirt, and you put a little more dirt and a little more dirt on top of that. So the first point, older inequalities provide the foundation for newer inequalities. These are the older inequalities, like a step of pyramid, providing the foundation for the newer ones. So patriarchy, which is the most ancient of these, even if it's never been universal. It's still not universal. There are a few places in Tibet in the mountains that you can find. Anyway, provided the foundation for an ancient system of exploitation, which provided a foundation for a modern system of exploitation involving race and location, which provided the foundation for industrial capitalism. So imagine a step pyramid of all of these inequalities, dirt, 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 each one of these different types of things. Now, again, technology. They are reinforced one to the next. So the technological thing to think about is, imagine people taking big steel rods and starting, every time you build a new level, You take your big steel rods and punch them down through from plunder into patriarchy, reinforcing the patriarchy below you. I like industrial stuff, so these kind of engineering things. So that's the problem. That's the problem. And I want to just very briefly talk about a little bit about how these things work over time. So I'm not going to talk about the origins of patriarchy, although I could go on and on about that, because that's actually something that is not settled, whereas most of the other things are settled in terms of our historical understanding. But patriarchy provided the foundation for the state and for the type of system that goes on after the formation of the state, because the patriarchy basically created a system where you had older men controlling younger men who have weapons, and they enabled the creation of a type of system where war and raiding, and allowed a system where war and raiding and the protection of public goods, the public goods being primarily grains of different sorts, could give increasing power to a ruling class. The book I have there is actually, if there's anyone here who's a graduate student, this is like one of the great works on patriarchy, but it was written in 1987. And there's so much more archaeological knowledge now and other knowledge that there really needs to be a new historical study of patriarchy. There are other things that one could put there, but increasingly there's this understanding that early state societies, early civilizations, early cities, they sort of worked by having places where there was a great deal of wealth in terms of grain stored in particular places, so that people who were in famine would come to the cities and be controlled by the ruling class of the cities, who controlled the granaries. Easy to understand. Anyone who remembers the story of Joseph in the Bible, that's the deal. That's how ancient cities worked. That's how states got established. Okay, creating the foundation for something later. Kojin Karatani, who's a Japanese political theorist and historian, is someone everybody should read. Kojin Karatani argues that the ancient system that was with us until 1500 of the operation of most civilizations is one of war and raiding to take slaves and women, slaves, and to take over territory and the goods that are on that territory is basically the source of society. That system of war and raiding, et cetera, the basis of our civilization was the basis on which our modern society was established. At the same time, going downward, the existence of the state that did this sort of thing has been reinforced patriarchy through the system of having a male monopoly on the means of violence. Joshua Goldstein, the guy who wrote the thing about why peace is breaking out, his most famous book is actually one that's called War and Gender, where he asks the question that everybody in international relations should ask, but everybody's afraid to ask, which is, why is it that war is controlled almost universally by men? That's it. The state had a patriarchal basis that gets reinforced by this. Okay, race and location. The modern world, again, going upward, the modern world of industrial capitalism was based upon the wealth that was created through the Atlantic slave trade. Even the institutions of modern capitalism, such as the factory, if you want to see the earliest factories, as they were called, go down to Trinidad and see the slave-based refineries for sugar. The organizational structure of modern capitalism and the capital for modern capitalism came out of the Atlantic economy. The Atlantic economy was based on, continues in certain ways to be based on, the same system of plunder, which is the ancient way of doing things. Arguments about where our racism comes from, I think the materialist arguments that say race is invented as a justification for the economic system have much more basis than some argument that says human beings have a tendency to see skin color or something of that sort. Upward, then, is this basis for the new society. Downward is, of course, that in all of the Atlantic economy and afterward, the privileged have pitted women, blacks, the colonized, and the dispossessed against one another. That's the reinforcement that comes from the racial system for the continuation of plunder and patriarchy. Still with us. Finally, industrial capitalism, again, the politics of industrial capitalism, is the periodic divide and rule done by the privileged, but on a global scale. Our last election in the United States was a divide and rule tactic having to do significantly with race, region, gender, which side are you going to be on, who are you going to vote for, and creating a situation where even if it wasn't a majority that voted for the current government, it was a group that felt dispossessed from their class interests, perhaps because of their interest in their particular racial group, or in some cases in their gender group. This is the politics of the way our society is held together, which leads to the last part. If we really want to solve this problem, and which all of us kind of need to solve because this is a problem, again, that affects, ultimately, it's a problem of those global issues that are existential. If we're going to do that, we need to have a politics of broad, complex solidarity across all of the lines of inequality. And this is something that's for all of us. I mean, it may seem bizarre for me to be talking about this in this way. I'm a privileged, upper class, in some ways, at least upperish class, white, northern male. I've got all the privilege around. But to change the world that we're in is in my interest as well. The phrase, "this is for everyone," comes from another privileged, white, northern male, Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who kind of invented the World Wide Web. And this is the picture from, did any of you watch the London Olympics opening in 2012? And there's Tim Berners-Lee. He makes this kind of claim that the World Wide Web that he's created was for everyone. He's one of those people we study in this book, Engineering Rules. And he actually makes the same argument, not as articulately and not with all the references to good political science literature, that we can't solve the global existential problems without finding ways to cooperate across all of these lines. And I think that's the argument that I would make. Remember back, I gave you the formula of how one solves global problems. You start with advocacy. You start with saying, here is a problem that needs to be a problem and it is solvable. The late Robert W. Cox, who's been mentioned earlier by Andy Knight, and who died a few days ago, Cox argued in most of his 5 or 10 last writings that one of the really good things about climate change was that it provided a grounds at which we can see, all of us, can see that we're all in this together. And so advocacy, that's a starting point. Get people to know that there's something that needs to be solved. Research, my argument would be that what I've been trying to do, maybe not in the talk, but at least in the work that went behind the talk, is to do a little bit of research and try to understand the politics of how you could make this possible. Research also comes up with policy ideas. We actually have all the policy ideas we need to deal both with, believe it or not, global inequalities, let alone with climate change. We really know how to do it. We actually even have institutions that could do it, even if they are these terrible institutions that are connected into the Westphalia system. That's time for another talk. But we haven't made it somebody's job to do it. We haven't made it somebody's job to collect the information on wealth, for example, in order to be able to tax it. That's Thomas Piketty's kind of argument about how we can deal with some of the, create a greater inequality along lines of social class. We haven't made it somebody's job to monitor and enforce the non-production of gases that are creating climate change. We need to be able to do all of those things. I'm just telling you a bit about a little bit of research, and I'm trying to make the argument that we have a grounds on which we can all advocate that change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that beautiful presentation. We have now time for questions, and you really should take advantage of this time and ask all the questions you wish. And please, yes, we can get started.
This is actually in the form, is this on? Okay. This is actually in the form of a request. On the slide where it said men carried out legitimate violence,
Yeah.
I wondered if you'd put a D after legitimate, because before we carry out violence as a social group, we always legitimize it by dehumanizing or by convincing ourselves rationally that the victim would be much happier if we did that to them.
I will.
Thank you.
Questions?
Good.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I'd like to know whether you've looked into some of the examples of building that complex solidarity.
About?
Building complex solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, this is the, to go back to, in a sense, to the last slide, where complex solidarity, which means solidarity across all of these lines of inequality, actually has been most successful in being built, is in situations where the movement involved is a movement that is defining itself not solely in terms of the one line of inequality or another. So there's something that you're talking about other than that. So, for example, the Quit India movement was defined as the Quit India movement. I mean, it was defined as a movement of decolonization. But it was a movement that actually united groups that consciously were concerned about their religious inequality, about their class and caste inequality, and about gender inequality. So thing number one is there has to be a focus beyond any of the individual inequalities or all the inequalities together. That's number one. Thing number two is you can't deny the existence. Okay, this is sounding like I know this better than I do. This is the hypothesis that I am working on right now in my research, is that you can't deny the real existence of each one of the lines of inequality which organize people because they can see them in certain ways in their most immediate daily life. You can't say, we're going to be fighting against climate change, and that's going to be groovy and everything will be solved. No. You have to say, we're going to be fighting against climate change, but to fight against climate change, we need a more democratic society, and to have a more democratic society, we have to deal with each of the more democratic global society. We have to allow the space for social movements that are concerned with each of these, and probably other, dimensions of inequality to exist and not deny their reality, and let the conflict among what is going to be the priority at one moment or another, let that conflict exist and be handled productively. Because if you don't do that second step, you're back to having just Tim Berners-Lee and me in charge of the movement. And that's not going to result in democracy, because, we're the ones with power already, right? It hides, it elides, it pushes aside the other sets of political challenges that stand in the way of something that looks like real democracy. My friends, I have groups of Facebook friends that I always think about, I really want to tell them this. I have one group of Facebook friends that are all good Marxists, who believe in the working class and say the whole problem in the United States right now is that the white male working class has been screwed by globalization. Okay, they're more sophisticated than that. But that's not going to get you there. It's not going to get you to a kind of successful coalitional politics that will transform even little old United States of America, let alone anything else. And the same is true for many other individual divisions. A lot of the engineers, as much as I love them, the engineers have a tendency to say, and this is true in the 1880s just as today, is to say there's a single dimension on which we need to worry, that we need to worry about, and all the other things are less important. They don't get it quite right.
Appreciate all the things that you're saying about the socio-political changes that are needed to deal with climate change. My question is, under the assumption it's happening and will continue, what are we going to do about it? Have we got any plans for dealing with the displaced populations with ocean rise? Do we have any plans to deal with the effects of transformations in the seasonality of our crop growing in places and stuff like that? All of these are the real problems with climate change.
Well, obviously, we do have people who are working on those things. The really unfortunate thing, the UN panel makes this clear in the kind of arguments they're making now, is that each of those kind of partial reactions, they're reactions to compensate in one way or another. Robert Parlberg has this wonderful book called The United States of Excess, which is, I urge everyone to read, where he says that there's a cultural thing in the United States where we in the US kind of like to let problems become disastrous and then kind of deal with the things that are the consequences. The problem is that we should certainly keep doing all of those, thinking about the consequences and thinking about canals in Boston and all kinds of other, and moving crop production north, but there isn't enough room. Anyway, we should be thinking about all of those things, but the likelihood is that we're going to have social collapse before an aggregate of all of those kinds of solving solutions are solving the immediate consequences are going to get us to be successful. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. My question is actually a bit related. So yeah. I really like how you say the third step of making it somebody's job as a crucial step to solving it. But you also say that the institutions that we have for global governance are not really fit for the job, or they're not fit for
They're
the
not
purpose.
fit for the specific reasons that I put there, which I'm trying to overcome, right?
Yeah. So then my question is, whose job is it, given that these are the institutions that we have and they're very difficult to change? Whose job is it? And if it's not one institution or one kind of group's job, then it's many people's job, and does that just diffuse responsibility?
Well, I think it probably is many people's jobs, and it is many different institutions' jobs. When you think about issues of climate change, some of the things are questions that are about measurement. I mean, we need to be able to make sure that we know, well, we know the science that is associated with that, and that's something that, yes, there is this little intergovernmental panel that works on this that gets to be called the UN panel, but it isn't really the United Nations. It's actually an awful lot of private institutions that work as scientific institutions in one way or another, and governmental institutions cooperating with each other. We need to have ways of measuring outputs of different sorts. A lot of that is being done by some of the organizations Joanne Yates and I have been studying, which are transnational, non-governmental, supposedly, organizations that are connected to things like the ISO. I don't worry about multiple organizations very much. I do worry a lot about coordination among them, and that's to go back to the question to Charlotte Koo earlier. I do worry about that, but I think we can actually often solve those things. But I think these jobs can be separable. Measuring is one thing, enforcing things is another thing, et cetera. They can be separable, and they can be done by many, many different kinds of organizations. They don't all have to be intergovernmental organizations associated with the United Nations, have blue flags or anything of that sort. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for your excellent talk, and I'm looking forward to your book. I was really interested in the chart that you had on global problems.
Yeah.
And you've got problems of the head and problems of courage. I see a link there. The largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet is the US military.
Correct.
In Canada, the largest institutional consumer among all federal agencies is the Canadian military, yet military emissions are exempted from national greenhouse gas inventories. They're exempted from reduction targets, and they're exempted from reporting requirements. So there is no possibility for us to tackle the climate change problem if we don't tackle the militarism problem. I assert that we're not going to be able to decarbonize if we don't demilitarize. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the intersectionality of the problems. The other thing that I was curious about is are your kind of inspiring examples of complex solidarity? What are some of the things that bring you hope?
Inspiring examples of complex solidarity. Much of the decolonization movement in the history of decolonization is actually perhaps the most inspiring set of examples of complex solidarity that we have. That's a simple version of that. I could do some other things as well. I mean, unfortunately, some of the other examples are things that are associated with militarism. The coalition that won the Second World War is understood as a broad social coalition, is an astonishing example of complex solidarity. I don't like to talk about that, but it is. Yeah. So this is kind of half of the story in the book. Remember, I said that there were these two fundamental problems that are existential problems. The other one is the prospect of nuclear war, atomic weapons. When you start unpacking that one, you start talking about militarization of society, right? And I think you have to work. Probably the real world answer is you have to start working in both directions. That this is the issues that we face, and particularly that those born in the 21st century face, involve both of those, but unfortunately also require that we work in the middle as well. That's the complexity of the problems. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much both for the pyramid of inequalities and for this chart here. Let me help you out and make everybody's day very happy with all of our complexities of problems. In that blank space in the lower left-hand corner, you can add something that we really don't talk much about, and that is chemical. Cadmium, mercury, arsenic, lead, and all of the man-made chemicals. they're far, far worse than we yet know, and they're going to start hitting the surface, especially with the toxic body load that we all bear. So FYI, feel free to add that one.
Gee, it's a balanced chart then, I guess. It's still a small number. Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciated what you were saying about letting sort of the conflict exist in a productive way between individuals who are experiencing some sort of harm or suffering and the patriarchy, if you will,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term. But how, I don't know if you have any advice for facilitating that conflict to exist in a productive way.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess I do. Although, this is
Somebody's job and advocate for it.
no. This is actually quite a different answer. I mean, there are certain issues about deep structural inequalities really can only be solved in two ways, and maybe only in one way. I mean, this goes back to work by Anatole Rappaport back in the 1960s when he wrote this really weird little book called Fights, Games, and Debates, where he says that, you know, conflicts are conducted in three different ways. One is that they're conducted like fights where you destroy, the aim is the destruction of the other, and the resolution is the destruction of the other. The second is what he calls games, which include everything that you can model by game theory. Rappaport became famous as one of the founders of game theory. Everything that can be treated as a bargaining situation, you know, good things and bad things, etc. And the third is debate, and by which he meant he had this idea of ideal scientific debate, which actually doesn't really exist. But ideal scientific debate looks something like deliberative democracy. It means people working toward consensus. And we actually know lots of things about how you can run meetings and do a whole bunch of things that involve consensus seeking. It means not shutting people up. It means, you know, it means being willing to identify where you agree, where you disagree. It means trying to think about how to resolve issues that you disagree about, etc. And then, you know, some years later, Rappaport wrote a big fat book which is called Conflict in Man-Made Environment, terribly sexist so that we don't read it anymore. But a central part of conflict in man-made environment is he says that I live in a society, in those days it was Canada, but I live in a society where most people believe that everything can be bargained over, that everything is a game in the sense of, you know, something that you can split the difference and all of that sort of stuff. And it turns out that structural conflicts, like conflicts over inequality, you can't have a bargain between the masters and the slaves that solves the conflict. You either abolish the slave system by abolishing the masters and not having the slaves for some reason replicate it, or else you actually have to go through that other complicated process, which is, I have a friend who's a very strong pacifist who says, you know, it's wonderful because it's a pacifist process, but it is also very, very difficult. And historically, I think that again, this is a person I'd point to who writes along this line is a Tibetan guy who usually goes by his sort of, he's a monk, but he goes by the name Samdong Rinpoche, who's also a Gandhian theorist. And, you know, Samdong argues that in case after case, where you see successful transformation of deep structural blah, 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 it is through a process, and, you know, it's case base that he looks at. It's through that kind of process that Rappaport was talking about, or that we could talk about as a process of consensus making or of deliberative democratic decision making. It's real difficult, though.
I have a question that regarding the relationship between migration and what we call the concept of countries. And given that there were no countries before the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, because even our own country was still buying its final real estate from Russia in the latter 1800s, and we had westward movement that was still colonizing throughout the world. All we had was colonial, dynasty, etc., throughout history, up until the 20th century. And then the 20th century was really the first century of true sort of stable set countries. Also, before that time, before the concept of countries, migration was fluid, depending on people's need to stay alive, make a living. They simply kept shifting to wherever they could do that. Now we're in this concept of countries, and we've just watched the tragedy of Syria. And as great as a tragedy as it is with refugees and migration, we're guaranteed that it's only a dry run that we're facing with climate change. We know that Bangladesh, Lagos, Nigeria, all these coastal cities, huge populations where most of the poverty is at the coast. Okay. Well, in Guyana, I asked a fellow who was vice president of Guyana as we were along the Brazilian border, you know, Georgetown is going to be underwater, and that's 60% of your population. Is everybody inland going to say, come on in, you can have some of my land? And that started an interesting conversation. This conversation really didn't happen as much before the concept of countries. So my question to you is, what do you foresee in the evolution of mankind's concept of country in the upcoming overwhelming migration of people due to climate change?
So first, I want to say that I understand the history just a little bit differently than you do. The little bit differently is that from the time of the earliest civilizations, from Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, the Indus civilization, perhaps, although we don't have a written record of the Indus civilization, so we can't really tell. But we know in the other three, there was from very early time an idea of rightful resident. That is to say, a territorial basis of what the empire was supposed to be, or the city-state, and those who, when they were inside the borders of these places, were either rightful residents or else guests or else conquered people, right? Those categories have been with us for a really, really long period of time. The 19th century changes, I think, are twofold. This is to say. One is that we started to get this idea that people who had imagined, who had a national imagination, who imagined themselves to be a particular type of people, were the folks who were supposed to be the rightful residents, right? And that everybody who was in that group was somehow supposed to have the territory that corresponds with that. So that's one change, which is this kind of notion that the place where rightful resident gets defined starts to adhere in the nation. And the second is our technologies of controlling borders got better. And that's really a big deal, that our technologies of controlling borders got better. So in one sense, my argument would be that what we're witnessing now, and a lot of it has to do both with climate change and with other aspects of inequality. I mean, our most armed borders around the world, as Branko Milanovic points out, are the places where there's the greatest income inequality from one place to the next. I think we're going back to the old way, in the sense we're going back to what was perfectly reasonable in which was that we had this concept of rightful resonance, and then we had the people who were there, right? That's because the borders are porous. I have this, my personal belief is that and this, you know, I know that this is a really crazy belief. The only people who really believe this are true liberal economists, is that all borders should be open. And that we should be that maybe we could just get rid of that crazy idea that's been around since the beginning of civilization, because it'll be just a lot easier if we recognize that our lives are actually connected to the residents who happen to be there, even if they happen to get there by walking or escaping or doing other things. I think that's personal preference. What do I think is going to happen? I think we're going to, our political systems, our ways of understanding the craziness that's going on will look more like what the world was like prior to the point where it was easy to control borders. That's all.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I would like to say thank you very much. There are some of us here who are not academics, and it's not that we don't appreciate it or appreciate where your thinking is coming from, but one of the concerns I have is that your idea is make it somebody's job. In my opinion, it has to be everybody's job, and that we have relied too much on leadership, which has been failing us constantly, especially today, with people becoming more authoritarian, more territorial, more us against them, and doing things in our name as societies that we totally object to on moral and principled and ethical grounds. How do we make it everybody's job instead of relying? I know when I talk to people, they feel it's not their job. How do we convince them?
Yeah, I think when I think about making it somebody's job, I'm thinking about a civil service. I'm thinking about people who have specific things like measuring this or that. My mother worked for the Census Bureau when she was throughout her career. She went and talked to people like prisoners and all kinds of odd people in various surveys, but she had a job of collecting, not just every 10 years, but continuously collecting data. It was a real important job, even though she wasn't paid much or anything. And that's when I'm really saying make it someone's job, I'm thinking of a lot of people doing a lot of jobs that are not fancy leadership jobs. When I think about the leadership, and I thank you for your question because it gives me the chance to say it, the leadership has to be done by us all because the leadership has to come out of democracy. It has to come out of a system where we are engaged citizens who are able to protect our interests and think about the general interest and debate and control and not be ruled by an oligarchy, as if it were a democracy. So yes, the way that we can do that, the way that we can, I'm going to start sounding, the way that we can become the leaders is just to seize that power. There are more of us than there are any of those political leaders. I'm now sounding like some awful populist or something of that sort, but it's true. There are. So that would be how we do it. We just do it.
Okay. I think that's a lot of questions.
Yes,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. Dr. Murphy, thank you.